Hello.
Hi,
Hi everyone, how are you?
we're good. Welcome. I'm Amy Morris. I'm one of the librarians here at Pima County Public Library, and my associate Carl and I will
Hello.
be, yeah, we will be moderating and facilitating, and one of our associates and fellow librarians, Mira, is the the tab leader, so she's here as well with the River Library Teen Advisory Board group. Um, and welcome to the teen and tween audio interviews for the Tucson Festival of Books. And we're excited to be interviewing, they're excited to be interviewing you, Tui, T. Sutherland. And they read your book from last year, Poison Jungle, from Wings of Fire. So, and I know a lot of them have read some of your other books as well. So I know they're very excited to ask you some questions today.
Awesome.
So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. Wow. Hi, everybody. This is really fun. It's funny because all the events I've been doing are just like my face on a screen, which is very strange. You know? I'm like, am I talking to myself? It's possible. So to get to see other people is really lovely.
Yay. Yes. Welcome. But go for it, whoever's first.
Hi, so I'm Nija. It's great to meet you. So
Hi,
my
Nija.
first question, would be throughout the Wings of Fire series, the theme of finding friends that last forever instead of relying on an unknown or uncaring family is emphasized. What made you choose to focus on this?
Oh, that's so interesting. What a great question. I definitely feel like I'm interested in the idea of sort of found families, like in the idea of finding the people that will help you be yourself and like believe in you the way you are. And I think some people are lucky enough to have that within their own family, but I'm interested in the dragons that have to go look for it, you know. I actually think that there's an interesting contrast between the 5 dragons in the original books who have each other versus the sort of what we call the fake dragonettes of destiny, who have each other but don't have something that binds them all together. So like the first dragonettes have Clay, who is it sounds funny because that's his name, but Clay is definitely the dragon that like makes them a family. You know, he's very devoted to keeping them like together and to believing in each other. So overall, I mean, I hope that there are some decent families, and you know, brothers and sisters in particular. I will say, the first 5 books have a lot of like sibling support, because my sister is my best friend, and I've written some books with her, and I love her very much. But then between books 5 and 6, she moved to California, which is the other coast from me, and so now all the books are about how your siblings will betray you in the end. So that definitely comes up a little bit in books 6 through 10, but I still love her. And yeah, I do think that it's important for everybody to know that, like, even if you don't have that support at home, you can find it somewhere else. You just have to find your people. Does that answer the question? Thanks.
All right, I'm Lily. My question is, so when you first came up with the idea for Wings of Fire, were you planning on writing a lot of stories in that universe, or were you only expecting to write the first 5 books?
Oh, that's a great question too. I definitely had a plan for 5 books. That was my notion was, if this is all I get to write, then I'm gonna make sure it has a beginning and an end, and it feels like satisfying for each one of these 5 characters. But as I started inventing the world and coming up with all the tribes, there was definitely a part of me that was like, well, I hope I get to stay and play with these characters a bit more, you know, because I could feel like there was so much still to do with all the dragons that you see on the periphery of their lives. So I was really excited when the books did well enough that Scholastic said, hey, do you want to do 5 more? And then maybe 5 more after that. So it's really, I just feel very lucky that I've gotten to do more stories in this world. But at the beginning, the plan was just for the first 5.
Hello, my name is Vasu. My question is, which of the 3 series was your favorite to write? And was it easier to write the sequel series already having a base world to write your characters into?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, really good question. It's hard to say which was my favorite to write. I think I really enjoyed doing books 11 through now 15 is the one I'm working on, because I felt like I learned a lot from writing the first 10 in the other continent. So when I got to start over in book 11 in a way to create new tribes and a new history for those tribes, I felt like I already had learned a lot about all the things that I did with the first 10 books. But I love, for me, really, it's about the characters. And so each of my favorite books has a lot to do with like which characters I love to write. Like I loved writing book 8 because Peril is just one of my favorites. She's very different from me. And so getting to kind of write in her voice has always been really fun. I'm trying to think. Yeah, so it's hard to say like a favorite arc. There's definitely like usually in each arc there's at least one book that's a bit of a struggle and one book that feels like it's going really well. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Millen, and my question is, what got you into writing fantasy novels, and were there any writers who inspired you?
Oh, sure. I love that question. I mean, so it's interesting because over my time being a writer, I've written about 50 books now, and most of them are fantasy, but I've gotten a chance to play in a few different genres. So I've written a couple of historical fiction books that are spin-offs of Little House on the Prairie. I've written a nonfiction book that's a biography of Harry Houdini, and I've written realistic fiction as well. So I've kind of gotten an opportunity to try out all the different genres, and I keep coming back to fantasy because, first of all, I feel like it's the most fun for me. Like, whenever I run into a plot problem, it's a lot easier to solve in a fantasy world where like something magic can happen or like, new characters can fall out of the sky, versus like, I keep thinking of this one book I wrote in the Pet Trouble series where I was like, all I have is this girl and this dog. Those are the only like things I have to solve this problem with, and they were still fun to write. But fantasy also gives you this sort of big epic palette for like dealing with metaphors and dealing with all the problems that people have to deal with in sort of a big, exciting way. So I do love coming back to fantasy. I think in particular, I would say authors that have inspired me. I often talk about Anne McCaffrey, who wrote The Dragon Riders of Pern. And those were really fun. I read those when I was a kid, and they sort of sparked my love of dragons, probably. Jo Walton, who is an adult fantasy author, she wrote a great dragon book called Tooth and Claw. That is from the point of view of dragons. They're really different from the Wings of Fire dragons. It's more of like a Anthony Trollope, Jane Austen kind of society. So, but with dragons. And so that one was, and I love all her books. I think she's really talented and amazing. And then sort of for the younger audience, I would say Grace Lynn, who wrote Where the Mountain Meets the Moon, is someone else that writes amazing dragons. And I really love her. So those would be 3 that come immediately to mind.
I just have a follow-up question to that question. So how has writing in genres outside of fantasy influenced your writing within fantasy?
That's a great question, actually. Because one that I think about a lot was my historical fiction writing, where I was specifically writing 2 books that were supposed to be connected to Little House on the Prairie. It was one of them was kind of on the banks of Plum Creek, but from Nellie Olson's point of view. And the other one was a continuation of Farmer Boy. It was like what happened to El Monzo after Farmer Boy. And so the really key thing about those books was matching the style of Laura Ingalls Wilder, who writes very differently from me. If you read them now, like there's a little less like sarcasm and capitals in her writing, but she's really talented in her own way. Like those books, there was a lot to learn from reading them. And I think one of the things that I learned was sort of slowing down to describe things. Like she does a lot of really, I'm trying to think of the right word for it. Like you can feel like you're there from the way she describes the setting. And so it helped me a lot because that's always been one of my sort of weaknesses as a writer, I would say, is describing the setting that I'm in. So I feel like the Wings of Fire books and all my fantasy books became better because of writing books where I had to spend a lot of time matching another author's style. Same with the Aaron Hunter books. Those books all have a certain style and a certain voice to them that's a little different from mine. So I do think that it's kind of a fun exercise to try and make your writing match somebody else's for a little while, just to see like what you can pick up from that and then bring back to your own voice. Does that make sense?
Hi, I'm Izzy. And my question is, throughout the Dragon Slayer, it seems like a recurring theme is about the human, at least the Dragon Slayer Legends, the extra book. It seems like the humans' inherent mistrust of dragons, especially in the older generations of characters, keeps coming up. And I wanted to ask, why did you choose to focus so heavily on portraying the younger characters as open-minded, especially Ivy, despite her relationship with her father?
Oh, interesting. So, sorry, you cut out a couple of times. So you're talking about how the older generations of humans really don't trust the dragons, but the younger generations are maybe more open to it, right?
Yeah, especially Ivy.
Yeah. That's interesting. I guess I was thinking about a few different things. So I was thinking, I do think that you see that a lot in our world, that like, I mean, this is a huge overgeneralization, but I feel like the younger generations tend to be more open-minded about people that are different from them. And that's wonderful. I think that's really cool. And so I think I wanted to have a little hint of that sort of progress in their world as well. And I also was just thinking about all of the young readers that I've met who have read these dragon books and are super excited about dragons. And so I wanted them to sort of see themselves a little bit in characters who love dragons, even if technically these characters should be a little afraid of being eaten by them, But like, I love dragons, and a lot of the people I've met just kind of love the idea of dragons. And I wanted to capture that a little bit in Ivy as someone specifically who just thinks dragons are amazing and like knows she has to be careful around them, but also can't help kind of wanting to know more about them. So it was kind of a two-part thing. It was partly like wanting to reflect to the readers I've met who love dragons, and then also wanting to show the progress that can be made in like the next generation. Because I think it's true of the dragons too, in the reverse. Like the older dragons are like, oh no, humans are just for eating. They're delicious. And the younger dragons are like, well, we could actually maybe understand them a little more. Like, hey, have you noticed some of these humans actually seem a little more complicated than the squirrels, and maybe we should try understanding them a little bit more. So I wanted to show that was progress happening from both sides, the younger humans and the younger dragons. That's what I was thinking.
Hi, I'm Shivam Kedia, and I just wanted to it's amazing to meet you. You're one of my favorite authors. And before I ask my question, I was wondering why you chose dragons. I think they're an interesting choice in all the animals you can choose from. And I was curious as to why you chose it.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's funny, like I've been asked that question before, and I feel like I don't have a great answer because I just love them. I think I do feel like writing about dragons, it is a little bit like writing, like everyone's a superhero. You know, they can all fly. A lot of them can breathe fire or do other cool dragony things. And I think also like writing about mythical creatures versus real life. Like I, worked on the cats and the bears before, but with mythical creatures, I could include, castles and books and have a world where they have pets and they have of their own and they have music. And so it gave me a little more to play with in terms of feeling like a big, exciting fantasy world. And then also like compared to other mythical creatures, dragons are very powerful. Like they're kind of the scarier end of mythical creatures. And that both gave me the chance to have some really fierce, like fun characters that can make a lot of change in their world, but also like play with what you expect. You look at a character like Clay and you think, oh, he's a big scary dragon, but because you're writing the book from his point of view and from the inside of him, you can see that like he's also really sweet, like, so I was able to it gave me both. It gave me like the excitement of having like big and scary and powerful, but also the human, that's the sort of human point of view that's inside of him. That's a little more like, I wanted to protect my friends, and I don't know if I'm good enough to save the world, and all the things that I think we can relate to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so my question is, in many books, I feel like the author embodies themselves and people they know in their books. And I was wondering who you relate most to.
Oh, that's fun. That's a fun question. I mean, it's interesting because I do feel like with each character, I have to give each of them something that I relate to in order to connect to that character and write their story. So there's a little piece of me in all of them, that's for sure. The one that I always say is the most like me is probably Sunny, who is the protagonist of book 5. Because I think that I also, like, if someone told me I was in a prophecy and I'd get to save the world, I'd be pretty excited. And I think she's, of those 5 dragons, she's the one that reacts that way. But there's a piece of me in like Tsunami. I'm a bossy older sister for sure. So there's, there's that. The dragons that are readers, like Cricket and Moon and Starflight. I mean, that's me too. Just like when Starflight feels like I could save the world if you gave me enough books on how to do that. I think there's a piece of me there too. Definitely, wanting to find the answers in books, and also to retreat into books, like the way Turtle uses books to sort of help him like hide from the world, but also figure out what to do with the world when he can't hide from it anymore. So I guess there's a little. I mean, the dragons that I love writing the most are probably the most different from me, but they still have like a piece of me in them. Like Queen Snowfall is nothing like me, but the fact that she's like really anxious and protective, I have that sometimes, certainly right now, worrying about taking care of my kids and making sure they don't go insane while we're all trapped inside is a big part of it. So sorry, that's a very long answer to that question.
Thank you.
Sure.
So I had another question. So in the first 5 books of the Wings of Fire series, the prophecy that guided the dragonets is shown to be fabricated. But through perseverance, and especially with Sunny's, dedication to this, the dragonets fulfilled it and drove their own destiny. So what message did you want to send to the reader, if any, particularly about the importance of intrinsic motivation?
Oh, I love that you said intrinsic motivation. That's fantastic. That is a huge part of it. Well, it was a few things. I'm very interested in sort of fate versus free will. And round about the time I was starting to work on these, I don't remember how close they were in time, but it was shortly after Lost had ended, the TV show Lost. And I felt like that show really ended on this note of like, everything is fate and you have no control over your life. I think there's a lot of ways to argue with that, but that was my impression of the show. And what I really wanted for these books was to have sort of an opposite message where, in fact, you do have some control and, you're in charge of your own destiny. And so even though there are prophecies in this world and there are dragons who can see the future, I always wanted to have a layer going through it that was like, but you're not stuck, you're not stuck on a path. You are the person or the dragon who gets to decide what happens to you and how you react to the things that go on around you. So that was really important to me. And I think it also was especially important with Sunny because she went through the first 4 books feeling like everything's going to be fine because I'm in a prophecy. So I don't have to worry about anything because the prophecy says I saved the world. So no matter what we do, it's the right thing. And so she had this sort of confidence and this sort of light, no matter what happens, this sort of hope. And then at the end of book 4, she finds out that the prophecy was made up. And so her journey in book 5 is like, I've just been told that there's no guarantees. I don't know for sure that I'm going to save the world. And, all of this could fall apart. But And a lot of her friends are like, well, okay, then we don't have to save the world. It turns out the prophecy was fake. And for Sunny, she's like, but somebody has to save the world. Like, we still have to do it. Like, we can't just this doesn't mean we should all just lie down and be like, oh, well, never mind. Especially because there's so many other people who believe in it. So for her, having to grapple with the idea that like nothing is guaranteed, but I have to try anyway. That was like so important to her character for me, that like that she would be like, this is not destiny, but it's still within my power. Like I'm gonna make it come true because I want it to come true. Does that make sense? It's like I thought about this a lot.
Yeah, I love that answer. Thank you.
Thank you. I love that question. Thank you so much.
All right, so my next question is, what was it like writing dragons that can read minds or see into the future?
Well, that's so funny. So the Nightwings, when I first conceived of them, I was like, there's going to be this tribe that is telling everyone they can read minds and see the future, but it's all a lie. And it's going to be really interesting because, they're kind of all about like the marketing. Like they're all about, this is the brand of the Nightwings, is we are the ones who have all these secret powers, and we're super secretive. And then as I was writing the books, I started thinking that I'm really interested in what if you could read minds? What if you could see the future? So I was like, is there a way that I can have both of these, that I can have it be a lie that they're telling, this big secret that the Nightwings are keeping, but then eventually get around to writing a character who can do those things. And so that's in book 6, when Moonwatcher appears. She actually, because of I don't know how long this podcast is or how much I should explain, but for Moonwatcher, she actually can read minds. She's the first dragon in many generations who can read minds and see the future. And that made book 6 really fun because I'm super interested in what it would be like to constantly have other people's voices in your head and have to reconcile what they say with what they're thinking. And so I also had to tell a murder mystery from the point of view of someone who can read minds. Because I was like, well, this should be over by page 3. Like, she's like, oh, it was you. I can see it in your head. So I had to come up with a bunch of different, it made it a really fun writing challenge, like a bunch of different ways, like why she wouldn't be able to figure it out right away. And like the different reasons she can't read certain dragons' minds. But I also think that, I wanted to get into a little bit of how, she thinks, I think we all think that like everybody is thinking about us, like there's very much, you go out in the world and you're like, oh no, that person noticed this terrible thing I did. And this person is thinking about how stupid I look and blah, blah, blah. And for what I wanted to do from Moon's point of view is kind of show that no, everybody is actually worrying about themselves. They're not thinking you did a stupid thing. They're thinking, oh no, I just did a stupid thing. So that's a more complicated answer, but I was really interested in that part of it for Moon, that like she gets to see kind of the inner life of all these dragons. And it also made it a fun way to introduce everybody in book 6, where I knew we were suddenly going to be meeting a whole bunch of new dragons. And I wanted to give them all a few more layers right away, than have to wait until book 10 to understand like how very interesting Kibley is, So that's a lot of reasons, but I really enjoyed writing a mind reader. It was very hard, but it was also, I think it was like a really fun writing challenge for sure.
So you made a couple of different series. What kind of research do you do, and how long do you spend researching before you start your books?
Oh, that's a great question too. I mean, I always think it's so funny to say that I do research for my dragon books, but I totally do. Because when I started imagining this world, I watched a whole bunch of nature documentaries to get ideas for the different dragons and the habitats that they lived in. Sorry, hang on a sec. There is a very loud beeping coming from outside, which never happens. I live in the quietest neighborhood. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. Okay. So let me go back. What was the question again?
What kind of research do you put in your books, and how long you spend researching?
Sure. Okay. So for the dragons, I spent a lot of time actually before book 11 doing some research on the different insects that I wanted to base the dragons on, because I knew I was starting over with a new continent and new tribes. So I'd say for the first book, like planning out all of Pyrea, I probably spent a year thinking about that, and then another year thinking about Pantala. I was still writing the other books like around the side, but those two probably, like in terms of concentrated thinking, researching, and watching documentaries to get ideas, probably a year for each of them. With something like the Little House on the Prairie books, that actually took a lot of research. And I actually went to the place where Almanzo Wilder lived when he was a kid, like in Farmer Boy. You can go visit it. I mean, probably not right now, but when I wrote the book many years ago. And it was super interesting because I wanted to make sure that I got it right, that it matched the story that Laura Ingalls Wilder was telling. Except it turns out that she totally made stuff up. She totally changed things for her books. So all the research I did, I was like, oh, wait, like everyone's the wrong age because she changed all their ages in her book. And so trying to like match it all up again was like what to keep so that it matched her book, but also matched history was a whole other like set of research challenges. Really fun though.
My second question is, what is your writing process and how did you find this process?
Oh, sure. So, I think you've probably heard other authors talk about the two types of authors, the ones that spend a lot of time plotting out and outlining the whole story, and the ones who just like sort of get started and figure it out as they go. And I think it's interesting because I'm definitely more of a figure it out as I go author, but I still spend a lot of time thinking about it beforehand. So I don't have the entire plot worked out, but I spend a lot of time on like the history, the backstory of the characters, and how we've gotten to the place we are when the story starts, and how I want the characters to develop, even if I don't know exactly what's going to happen to them. So my writing process involves a lot of like staring blankly at my computer. So my children are always like, that's not writing. You can come play with me. I'm like, no, this is important. This staring part is very important, actually. And then what I do is I have like lots of Word documents, basically, where I keep notes. So I have one that's like the big one for each book. That's like book 14 notes. And that's where, I put any sort of, I sort of throw any ideas I have in where I'm like, oh, I definitely want to have, these two characters have a conversation with each other. Or if I'm like, I know how I want this character to show up, at what point in the story should that happen? So it's sort of like throwing all of my ideas onto a page, and then I sit down, and usually like the first couple of chapters are really fun. Like I don't necessarily have to have everything figured out. I can just be like, here's the character, and here, like, what the most important thing in books, in like chapters 1 and 2, is understanding this character that you're going to be spending the whole rest of the book with. So in a lot of the books, that'll involve like a flashback to their history, something about their brothers or sisters, or what their parents were like. And then in some of them, I kind of have to jump right into the action, like book 13, where because of what happened at the end of book 12. But I still, because we get to finally be inside their head, I try to spend a lot of time in the first couple chapters really figuring out like what are the issues that this dragon is dealing with. And then usually I'll sort of figuring it out as I go for about half the book, and it's about halfway through that I stop and I do like a more detailed outline of like, okay, these are the important things that are going to happen. Now I'm pretty sure of what comes next, and then I write out like, and sometimes that will still change, but that's usually when I do more of a plot outline of like the second half of the book.
All of Ren's journey through the Dragon Slayer book is without any sort of human contact, except like the very beginning, And while she does finally reconnect with her brother and sister, any relationship that she used to have with her parents is never really restored. If anything, it's just completely cut off. So I was wondering what made you choose to have her relationship with her parents end, while some of her relationships like became rekindled.
Oh, that's a great question. Well, one thing is that when she finally gets back to her village at the end of the book, like we don't have a lot of time. Like there's a lot of things she has to do in that scene. So there wasn't really, I didn't want to fit in a whole like conversation with her parents as well, like a long sort of like, let's fix things. Cause I feel like, boy, that conversation would have to be pretty long. Like, I'm not really sure how she comes back from like, you left me to be eaten by a dragon on purpose. Like that's rough. That's a rough parent decision to have made. So I think for Ren and her parents, like it didn't seem like a scene that we could see like be over in a few pages. I feel like that's a whole book of therapy that they would have to work through. So I'm not sure that, I actually have talked about maybe doing another Legends book with those characters, because I did leave Dragon Slayer in a place where I feel like there's more to tell of that story. So if we do, then we might see more of like Ren and her parents. But also, like, I do think sometimes, when your parents have done something terrible, like maybe it's okay to move on and not go back and go over it again. I mean, hopefully they feel bad and maybe there's a way for them to like apologize, but I do feel like she'll have better luck with, her brother and sister instead. And then the other friends she's made along the way. Does that make sense?
So my second question is, I like your character arcs, like the development of your characters throughout the books. And one of the things that interested me the most was the big contrast between Tsunami and Glory in the Wings of Fire series. For me, Tsunami has always been like a leader. She was the strongest in the group, like the first couple, and Glory was kind of like the lazy one, right? But then, then the series, Glory's the one that becomes the queen, the strong one, the leader, and Tsunami kind of fades more to the background. And I was wondering what made you write these two characters mature in different ways.
Oh, that's really interesting to think about. I mean, I was definitely, well, I'll say off the bat that I think Tsunami still sees herself as a leader. She is not super interested in being queen of the Sea Wings right now. She's happy to let her mom keep doing that for as long as she wants. But she's, she would consider herself the boss of the Jade Mountain Academy, which is also in her mind very important. But I think for their character arcs, it's interesting because for Tsunami, what I was most trying to work through for her character arc is not making her less bossy or less of a leader, but learning to solve problems by talking about them and listening to other people instead of just attacking things or, her first impulse, whatever it is. So for her, I felt like that was a big part of book 2 was, don't just with the scene with the guards where she's like, I could go bully these guards into freeing my friends. But then she has a moment where she's like, well, maybe I could talk them into it. And she does. And so I feel like that's still strong leadership, and actually would make you a stronger leader to have that element. Whereas for Glory, her whole thing was her whole life feeling like she didn't quite belong in this prophecy and she didn't quite belong in this group. And therefore she had to prove herself by doing everything alone. So what she really wanted was to she's like, I'm just going to go solve this problem by myself. And so her arc was a lot about learning to let other people help her. And that's why at the end of the book, of book 3, instead of just her becoming queen by winning a contest and just being awesome, which she could have done, certainly, because I think she's pretty awesome. But I wrote it specifically so she needed to ask for help and she needed to work with this team of dragons and trust them, kind of like she trusts her friends, but these were new dragons that she had to sort of wrap her brain around. And so she does become a leader. But in her case, it's because of learning to trust other people. Whereas Tsunami doesn't necessarily, it wouldn't have worked in the story for her to become queen of the Sea Wings, but she is learning other things that will make her a stronger leader, as she goes forward. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay, so I had one more question. So in the Wings of Fire series, again, the names of dragons in many cases reflected, their physical characteristics or their behavioral characteristics. So that would be like Sunny, Tsunami, Clearsight, and Wasp. What made you choose to name dragons in this way?
Oh, great question. Well, it's interesting because when I first started the whole series, I was like, okay, I'm doing a big fantasy series set in this other world. I can just name the characters anything I want. They could just collection of syllables, just pick 5 random syllables and throw them together. And that's a dragon name. And then as I started writing, I got probably a chapter or 2 into book 1. And I realized oh no, Tui, your favorite thing to do is add characters. And this book series, if it keeps going, is going to end up with thousands of characters. And if each of those characters has like a multi-syllable nonsense name, like your poor readers, what are you doing? And more importantly, my poor editor, like Amanda, is like didn't start off as a fantasy reader, so she was like, what, how, who am I following here? So I was like, well, what can I do to make this easier for the readers, and not necessarily for the young readers who are pretty good at this, but for their parents, like anyone else who's trying to keep track of like who we're all talking about. And I was like, one thing I could do is give them each names that associate them with a particular tribe. So that would help, so that the minute you meet a character, you're like, oh, okay, I know pretty much what tribe this character is from. And then that gave me the opportunity to get to play with words a little more in terms of names that also tell you something about their personality. So, you're going to meet a very different sea wing if they're named Tsunami versus if they're named Turtle. And so that helps me give you a little clue about their character right from the beginning, right from the first thing you know about them. So yeah, it's been really fun. It's definitely hard. There are definitely times where I sit at my computer just Googling like, what animals live in the Arctic? Like, what the heck can I name this sandwing? This is so hard. There are certain habitats that are way harder than others. And that was partly why for books 11 and 12, I was like, I'm going to do some insect tribes because there are so many cool insect names that I could work with. And that also give you like, you obviously have two very different dragons if you're meeting a wasp versus a cricket. So, so it was really fun coming up with names. It's not always easy, but I do think about them a lot.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right. So my next question is, have you ever thought about writing a series that really focuses on older dragons as main characters?
Oh, that's a good question too. I was thinking about this the other day, about the fact that like all my dragons saving the world are like, they're like 6 or 7 in the world, but in my head, they're like your age. They're like teenagers basically. And I guess I feel like the older dragons are out there having adventures too, but because I'm writing in like the sort of children's and YA realm, I think it's sort of expected and it's sort of okay for me to focus on the younger ones. I'm trying to think of any that I've written that are a bit older, but I think that no, they're all younger. There's a few stories coming up in the guide to dragons that we're working on. We're working on this big like guide to the world that will have some older perspectives. But the reason that I write for kids is because I think kids are the most interesting people, honestly. Like I think kids and teenagers have all this potential to change the world. Like that's why I decided to write these books instead of adult books, because you could do anything. Like you guys are going to end up doing all kinds of exciting things. And I think that's what makes them so interesting as characters. Like you're not stuck, you're not in you still have all of these adventures you could have, and you can choose your path forward. I mean, even if it doesn't always feel that way. But so that's why I'm interested in them as characters, definitely. These sort of younger dragons. Does that make sense?
How did publishing your first book change your writing process?
Oh, how did publishing my first book change my writing process? So my very first book, let me see if I can find a copy to hold it up. Although I know this is just voice, but I'll show you guys. My very first novel that was published, it was called This Must Be Love. And this came out like 2004, like a very long time ago. And this is, it's like a retelling of Shakespeare. It's basically A Midsummer Night's Dream, but set in the present day in a New Jersey high school. And what I think the biggest thing about it that sort of changed the way that I write is, before I wrote it, I wasn't sure I could finish a whole book. I had all these ideas and all these things I was always working on, but would I ever get to the end of one? And so with this book in particular, I made a bet with a friend of mine that I could finish my book before he finished his. And so once it was a competition, I was like, this is happening. I'm doing it. And so I would go home after work. I was working in publishing at the time, and I would write every day until I finally got it finished. And then I got and then I went through the process of like giving it to editors to read, and getting an editor who was amazing. My very first editor, her name was Alex, and she's one of the most wonderful people I've ever met. And she worked through the whole process of me of like editing it and changing it. And that helped me think about all my writing in terms of like, A, yes, I can finish a book, and B, once I have a finished book, it's not perfect, and there's a lot of things I can do to fix it. And so it's okay if my first draft isn't perfect. And so I think that made me feel more confident going forward in terms of like the next book that I was able to finish. I was like, I can get to the end of a book, absolutely, and it's okay if I'm going to have time to fix it once I have an editor to work on it with. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Well, I'm just curious. Did you win your bet?
I did. I totally did. Thank you. Oh man, yeah, no, it was very satisfying. I don't think he has finished his book yet. Poor guy. He's so talented, and yet like he's doing a million other things. So one day I should occasionally email him and be like, keep going. I want to read it eventually. But yeah, no, it was I'm very competitive. Like I love games and competing on things, and like I was on Jeopardy, I think you guys know. So for me, anything that was like, once it was a competition, that was very motivating.
My last question is, you dedicated Poison Jungle to Hazel. Who is Hazel, and how has Hazel impacted your life or your writing?
Sure. I don't want to be too specific, but I think it's okay to say Hazel is somebody that I actually met at a book event. And she connected with me about, what can I say, about the sexuality of some of the dragons. And so knowing that I was going to finally be writing a book where Sundew and Willow were together, I was thinking of her and of all the other fans that have said to me, like we want to see ourselves reflected in this world, like we exist in the real world. And so she was really wonderful, and I had been thinking about her for a while after I met her, and how like I wanted to fit her, something about her into the world, to let her know that I love her, and everybody who needs to see themselves in a world like this. Does that make sense?
So I have one last question, a little bit more light. So throughout the entire story of Dragonslayer, the narration shifts between the points of view of the three main characters, like every chapter. But their stories only ever truly come together really close to the conclusion, and there isn't a book following it. So I was wondering what made you choose to have their stories be so independent for most of it?
Oh, that's a great question. So I knew at the beginning of writing Dragonslayer, I knew that in the previous books that it was going to overlap with books 1 through 5 of the main series. And in books 1 through 5, I had specifically had a couple of moments where you see humans in the background. Or in fact, in book 5, there's specifically an interaction between Sunny and the humans. And so when I wrote that, I was hoping that one day I'd get to do the human perspective on that conversation. Which is, I thought it would be really fun, actually, that Sunny's like, oh, I totally know what's going on here. And then you read the human side of it, and they're like, oh, I totally know what she's saying, and it's not quite right. You know, they're both very well-intentioned, but the communication is not 100% as it should be. So I always wanted to write that. I thought it would be really fun to get the human perspective on that. But I also wanted to have... to show that Leaf is the character you see in book 1 that Clay rescues. And then as I started planning, so I had those two clearly in my head, Ivy and Leaf. And then I was like, I want a third character, and I want her to have connected with a dragon. I want to have one character, one human in this world who has managed to bond with a dragon. Mostly because like I would like to bond with a dragon. And so I thought it would be really fun to get to write her story. And I was like, is there a missing dragon somewhere along the way that could be the dragon that she connects with? And so I had hoped for a while to bring back Peril's brother, who everybody thinks is dead. And so that was like the good place to put it in. But so in order to do that, I had to start with very young Ren, because I wanted her to be young when she meets Sky, because that's when Peril was born, like was hatched. So they're, like 8 years ago. And I knew also that I wanted to see Ivy and Leaf kind of like their earlier parts of their story. Like I couldn't start with Ren 8 years ago and then jump ahead to Ivy and Leaf as like grown-ups. So I had to include some of their growing up. And then this was definitely like one of the hardest parts of writing Dragon Slayer, was like, how soon can I get them all together? But they have all this stuff to do first. I have to get Leaf to like grow up, missing Ren, and then get him to the Skywing Palace, and then have him get nearly eaten, and then have Clay rescue him. And all of that has to be happening while Ivy is over here having her own adventures, because I still wanted to intersperse the chapters. And Leaf was like tricky, because he did seem like he was going off and doing all these other things. And I was like, Leaf, come on, join the rest of the story. Like get to the south part of the continent already. So I was thinking about them, all three of them. And that was one of the biggest things that changed in revisions. Is my first version actually had them coming together, and then like the book ended like two like a chapter later, basically. And I felt like it wasn't right. And so I wouldn't give it to my editor. And she was like, come on, Tui, finish the book. And I sat down with my sister, who is a great editor too, actually. And she read it for me. And she was like, Tui, you need like another 80 chapters of this story. And I was like, well, I don't think Amanda will let me write 80 more chapters, but I can probably do like 5 or 6 more chapters where we get to like relax into the story of them knowing each other. And we actually get to see like the Ren and Leaf reunion, which was really important. And then have her go back to her village. Kari was like, the most important part that I want to see is Ren going back to her village and burning it down. I was like, well, okay, that's probably not happening exactly, but we can have something happen. That would be kind of fun as well. So I am hoping that we get to spend a little more time with them if I get to do another Legends book. But it's a good question. Like that was sort of the process of writing the book. I realized it had so much, like I wanted to do so much with the story of getting them to where they all needed to be, that I couldn't start with the scene where they're together and Sunny meets them. And it did involve a lot of revising, even to make sure that I had them together for a significant part of the book. So well spotted.
Great. Did anybody have any other questions for Tui? Hey, well, thank you, Tui. That was very informative, and great job, guys. You had a lot of good questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's always like the most fun for me to get to talk to people who've thought about the book so much, and your questions were so like thought-provoking and interesting. So thank you, guys. This was like the most fun.
Yeah, we so appreciate it. And if everybody doesn't mind just smiling, we're gonna just take a screenshot of everybody. So ready, set, cheese. Thank you. Yeah, may you enjoy the rest of your day. And you're back east in Boston area? Yeah?
Yep. Yeah, so we're getting close to dinner time here.
Yes. Enjoy the rest of your day, and may spring come sooner than later, because I heard it it has
Tell me about it. I know.
For you guys. Yes. So, but thanks again. We appreciate your participation. So
yeah, you bet. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. It was
Thank
great
you.
to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
good evening. Take care.
Thank you.
You too. Bye.
Bye.